Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from Antiwar.com, and this is Antiwar News for Monday, November 14th, 2022. Hope everyone had a good weekend. The first story at the top of Antiwar.com today: Blinken and Sullivan oppose Milley's diplomacy push. This is not much of a surprise. So while we've had General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, publicly voiced support for diplomacy between Ukraine and Russia, other Biden administration officials are against the idea. And this is from a CNN report on Friday. They cited unnamed administration officials who said that Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan disagree with Milley and don't think that it's time to make a serious push for peace talks. So, just to go over what Milley said again, because it was really a pretty significant shift in the rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration. Milley said that he saw an opportunity for peace talks. He said they should seize the moment. This was during a speech at the Economic Club of New York last week. And there was also a few reports that said he has been pushing for diplomacy behind the scenes. And had the way that this CNN report put it, they said that Milley has in recent weeks led a strong push to seek a diplomatic solution to the fighting. But his position is not a popular one in the administration. One official said that the State Department has the opposite view of Milley. So I just put a short paragraph in from the CNN report. I just want to read it. It says, quote, one official explained that the State Department is on the opposite side of the pole from Milley. That dynamic has led to a unique situation where military brass are more fervently pushing for diplomacy than U.S. diplomats, end quote. So, I mean, it just really is shameful, I think, that Blinken, who's supposed to be the top diplomat, I mean, this is a pattern. This isn't just really a new dynamic here. I mean, Secretary of States have been so hawkish for, going back years and years now. But he really just throughout this whole war, Blinken and the State Department, they've shown virtually no interest in diplomacy with Russia. He's only spoken with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, only one time that we know of at least, since the February 24th invasion. And the conversation was not about the war. It was focused on a potential prisoner swap. But this situation kind of reminds me, I mean, it was more extreme, I guess, was back during the Obama administration. The person that talked Obama into intervening in Libya was Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, and the Pentagon didn't want to do it. But, it was the State Department and other officials too, but that really convinced them to intervene there in Libya. And now we're seeing the head of the U.S. military. He's the highest ranking military officer calling for diplomacy while State Department is against it. But when it comes to Sullivan, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, according to recent media reports, he has spoken with his Russian counterpart, Nikolai Patrushev, and I believe another aide to Putin. And the White House has confirmed that there has been high-level communication with Russia, but that was what they're saying was mostly on like de-escalation stuff, not so much on diplomacy. And Sullivan has also he did encourage Ukraine to soften its stance on talks with Russia, but he does still not he doesn't agree that it's time to push Ukraine to negotiate. And you also have to keep in mind that they might be trying to kind of feed us a narrative here about what's going on within the administration. But at the same time, Milley did say this publicly. It's not like we don't have a record of that. We've seen him say it. So I guess it does seem like there might be a real split here within the administration. And even if there were peace talks, I'm pretty pessimistic. I think the U.S. and Ukraine, they might want to pause the war for a bit while they regroup and rearm and train more Ukrainians. But because they are making big plans to keep supporting Ukraine, NATO and the U.S., they're ready to spend tens of billions more to keep doing it. But it's definitely there's definitely been a shift in the narrative, because just a few short weeks ago, if you called for diplomacy, everybody called you a Putin lover, but now you have Milley doing it. All right, so the next one here, this is actually from the Gray Zone from Alexander Rubinstein, and a Zelensky advisor threatened war with Iran. So this is Mikhailo Podolyak. He's an advisor to Ukrainian President Zelensky. He's called for attacks inside Iran as the country's drones cause setbacks for the Ukrainian military. So on November, this was on back on November 5th. Podolyak said this. Um, he has advocated for military strikes on drone production sites located in Iran. And Zelensky echoed Podolyak's belligerent rhetoric the following day, demanding Iran be punished for allegedly supplying drones to Russia. Kiev adopted its hostile posture towards Tehran after claiming Russia deployed Iranian supplied drones to strike Ukrainian civilian infrastructure throughout much of October. In an interview with the Ukrainian news outlet on November 5th, Podolyak argued that the response to Iran supplying Russia with drones should not be limited to sanctions or even a total trade embargo. He said, quote, "It seems to me that it should not be sanctions or even an embargo, yes, a total embargo. It seems to me that it would be possible to carry out specific strikes on the production of drones, ballistic missiles, and so on," end quote. So Iran's government has responded to the allegations by Ukraine and its Western patrons by acknowledging. So this is what Iran said recently. They're still denying that they sold drones to Russia while the war was going on, but they're saying that they supplied Russia's military with drones prior to the war in Ukraine. And according to Iranian officials, Iran was willing to review evidence that its weapons were used to attack Ukrainian infrastructure targets, and Russia has officially denied using Iranian drones. So who knows really what the situation is with that? But if you apply this logic of Podolyak, and you also have Zelensky, the day after Podolyak's tirade, Zelensky pushed the Iran issue following talks with the EU European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Um, just calling for punishment of Iran. But you apply this logic to what the US is doing with Ukraine. It's like, okay, so supplying weapons does make a country a target for a strike. I mean, it makes them a belligerent, it seems like, in Ukraine's eyes. So, you know, it's just interesting the dynamic there. All right, the next one here. This is from Kyle Anzalone. Ukraine plans to create an Israel like arms industry to produce NATO caliber weapons. So Kiev is planning a buildup of its weapons industry to produce more sophisticated arms, with Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov saying government takeovers of several companies will help Kiev to create an army of drones and other NATO caliber weapons. The defense chief noted that growing military ties between Kiev and the West makes Ukraine a de facto NATO partner. In an interview, this was this past Thursday, Reznikov told reporters that Kiev was seeking to replicate Israel's defense industry. The defense head argued that Israel's advanced defense industry helps it maintain its sovereignty, adding, quote, "I think the best answer can be seen in Israel developing their national industry for their armed forces. It made them independent," end quote. So if you remember, I think it was last week, I covered that the Ukrainian government used its martial law authorities to seize five Ukrainian companies. One of them was a major engine manufacturer. So I guess he's saying that they're gonna, and they said that they might take more companies. So I guess they might seize more to make it a nationalized industry. Um, so so again, this is more just these plans that they have. Going down the line here, that the US, NATO, and Ukraine, this is what they want. They want to keep being a partner of NATO and receiving all these weapons and being like interoperable with NATO forces, essentially making them a de facto NATO member. All right. So the next one here, Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, she said on Sunday that she believes some sanctions will remain on Russia even if Moscow reaches a peace deal with Kiev, demonstrating that the U.S. wants to keep pressure on Russia's economy for the long term. So this is kind of another sign that peace talks are unlikely because this is leverage that the U.S. has. They could offer sanctions relief if they're serious about trying to end this war. So I just mentioned in the story, in the wake of Russia announcing it was withdrawing from Kherson, there has been more talk about opening up negotiations to end the fighting in Ukraine. Yellen said that while some sanctions adjustment was possible, the U.S. would want to maintain pressure on Russia. So she said, quote, I suppose in the context of some peace agreement, adjustment of sanctions is possible and could be appropriate. We would probably feel, given what's happened, that probably some sanctions should stay in place, end quote. So another example of, I do believe that they've been wanting to try to hurt Russia with sanctions like this for a long time, especially the people in the Biden administration. So I don't think they want to lift these sanctions anytime soon, no matter what happens, even if that means more dead Ukrainians. But the sanctions campaign has largely backfired on the West. Europe is facing soaring energy prices, while Moscow's oil profits exceeded to levels higher than before the war. So, in an effort to curb Russia's profits, Yellen has led a G7 push to implement a price cap on Russian oil, which is supposed to take effect in December. So, this is another really foolish plan, it seems like, because this price cap could really hurt the Western economies even more because it requires the cooperation of Moscow and its customers. And if Russia retaliates by cutting production, global oil prices could skyrocket. And this isn't just me saying it. I mean, tons of experts, analysts in the industry, oil industry, financial industry, maritime insurance industry, because this is over insurance. That's how they're going to leverage it, that they won't be able to use European insurance for their oil shipments unless they sell it at a set price. I've seen some insurers basically say there's no way to tell what price they're selling it at. Like they could kind of just fool us or forge documents. Anyway, but Yellen does seem like she backed off a little bit and has recognized some of the issues with this plan. She conceded on Friday that India could continue to purchase Russian oil at whatever price it wants. And India has become a major buyer of Russian oil and is already buying it at a discount. So they would have no motive to enforce this cap on Russia. And I think Yellen is realizing India isn't going to listen, and they don't. And they also want to kind of keep India happy. India's in just kind of this weird in between zone between the U.S. and Russia and China. But Russia has vowed to retaliate and said that it would not sell oil to any countries trying to impose price caps. Yellen said on Sunday that she doesn't know what the Russians will do. She said, quote, it's hard to know what Russia's response is going to be. I don't think that they can really afford to shut a lot of oil in. They need the revenue, end quote. So she's saying, well, we don't really know what they're going to do, but it could be a really bad result for oil prices. And, that's something we would really feel here if Russia cut its production significantly. I just want to mention this one. Connor Freeman wrote up on Friday that Russia announced that it completed its withdrawal from Kherson on Friday. So it was much quicker than Ukraine and the U.S. were expecting, because I went over a story on Friday that said the Ukrainian defense minister said that they needed at least a week, but they're gone. And all the maps show that Russia has gone over the Dnieper River. They retreated from the city of Kherson, and Ukraine's moved in. So that's done. So I just wanted to update you on that. And but the Kremlin is saying that the status of Kherson is unchanged. So that means that they still view it as Russian territory, signaling that they're gonna maybe try to push back in there. Who knows when? Maybe in the winter. Maybe there will be talks instead, hopefully, but we'll see what happens as we go on. All right, the next one here, shifting over to China. Biden seeks to establish red lines in his meeting with Xi Jinping. So President Biden said on Sunday that he's looking to establish what the U.S. and China's red lines are in a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping that is scheduled for Monday. So he said this from Phnom Penh, Cambodia, where he was attending the East Asia Summit. He said, quote, "We just got to figure out where the red lines are and what are the most important things to each of us going into the next 2 years," end quote. China has made very clear to the US that one of its red lines is the US increasing support for Taiwan and increasing formal ties with Taiwan. Beijing views the things that the US has been doing as going beyond the one China policy, but that has not stopped the Biden administration from taking steps to forge stronger ties with Taipei. It hasn't stopped Congress from doing so. Um, so the tensions over Taiwan are expected to be discussed in Monday's meeting, as well as new U.S. sanctions targeting China's chip industry, recent North Korean missile launches, and the war in Ukraine. When the Biden Xi meeting was first announced, a U.S. official said basically, big issues are not expected to be resolved. The meeting is going to be about managing tensions. And I think what Biden says here, what are our red lines? And hopefully they listen to him. I mean, it would be great if there's some kind of breakthrough, but I really doubt it. Just the way Biden has been very hard line on China. When it comes to the economic policies, much more so than Trump, he picked up on the trade war and ran with it. Um, okay, so the meeting, it's going to be the first time they hold in-person talks since President Biden came into office in January 2021. And it comes, just what's the backdrop here? US China relations are at their lowest point in decades, and the Biden administration has repeatedly named China as its biggest threat. They keep saying, forget Russia, China's the big one. Um, so that just doesn't indicate that they're looking to reduce tensions at all. It seems like they're preparing for a future conflict with China. So he's going to meet Xi on the Indonesian island of Bali at the summit of G20 leaders. And he attended the East Asia summit in Cambodia on Sunday. And he held a series of meetings with other world leaders, including Yoon Suk Yeol, the South Korean president, um, Japan's Prime Minister Kishida Fumio, and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. All right. So the next one here, more China related or Asia related. Southeast Asian leaders did not want the region to be the front line for a new Cold War. So this is Indonesia's President Joko Widodo. He took over the chairmanship of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations on Sunday. That's the ASEAN. That's a 10-nation block of Southeast Asian countries. So when he was taking over this chairmanship, he vowed not to let the region turn into a proxy between two powers, referencing the growing tensions between the U.S. and China. He said, quote, ASEAN must become a peaceful region and anchor for global stability, consistently uphold international law, and not be a proxy to any powers. ASEAN should not let the current geopolitical dynamic turn into a new Cold War in our region, end quote. So, I mean, if you're in Southeast Asia and you find yourself in between the US and China, I mean, if this Cold War does turn hot, where is it going to be fought? Most likely around Taiwan, and that's Southeast Asia, so it's going to be right in their neck of the woods. So they're not happy about these growing tensions, and they when tensions spiked in August after Pelosi visited Taiwan, the ASEAN they released a joint statement calling for the U.S. and China to ease tensions, and that's a pretty rare move for them. They usually don't put out stuff like that, but they weren't saying, "Hey, China, take it easy," or "Hey, U.S., take it easy." They were talking to both of them, which I thought was interesting. And the U.S. is looking to increase its military presence in Southeast Asia, but it's struggling to find a country that will get on board. They want a new fleet based in Southeast Asia, but there hasn't really been much progress there. And even the Philippines, which is a treaty ally of the U.S., meaning um, we've given them a war guarantee, they're not eager to pick a side either. With their new president Ferdinand Marcos Jr., he's made a point really to maintain good relations with Beijing, while at the same time, they're still holding lots of military drills with the U.S. Um, it's kind of a balance, kind of like Duterte, who's his predecessor. He seems to be continuing that. Um, so yeah, it's just again, if this thing turns hot over there, they're the ones that are going to have to deal with the consequences. Um, unless nuclear weapons are used, Americans, unless they're fighting or their families fighting over there, it's going to be the people in the region that suffer. All right, so the next one here, more Israeli airstrikes in Syria. This is from Jason Ditz. Syrian air defenses were active Sunday, intercepting Israeli missiles during an attack on the major Shayrat airbase in the central city of Homs. Details are still emerging, but at least 2 soldiers were killed. That's Syrian soldiers, and 3 more were wounded. Israel, as usual, declined to comment on the incident. That's typical. They usually don't say anything about their Syrian airstrikes, but we do know that it's them. Israel has been attacking Syria with increasing frequency in recent weeks. Many strikes were in Damascus. Air defenses intercepted some, but considerable damage was also inflicted. So there was a bit of a lull recently in Israeli airstrikes in Syria, but since they started bombing them again, they've really stepped it up. And there was just that one on the border crossing between Iraq and Syria. They killed at least 10 people, so pretty major strikes. All right, so the next one here, and more U.S. airstrikes in Somalia that nobody seems to really care about. U.S. Africa Command says 17 al-Shabaab fighters killed in latest U.S. airstrike in Somalia. So U.S. Africa Command said on Friday that it launched an airstrike in Somalia on November 9th in support of the U.S.-backed Mogadishu-based government, marking the second known U.S. airstrike in the country this month. AFRICOM said that the strike was launched in a remote region of Somalia about 177 miles northeast of Mogadishu. So that puts it in about somewhere in central Somalia, a little south of central Somalia. The last airstrike in Somalia reported by AFRICOM. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself there. So this strike that they just reported, the November 9th one, they're saying that their initial assessment found that 17 al-Shabaab fighters were killed. The last airstrike in Somalia, the previous one, reported by AFRICOM, took place on November 3rd. And in that operation, the command said 15 al-Shabaab members were killed. So, that's over 30. That's 32 people that the U.S. is saying they killed in Somalia within a week. So, it shows that this war is really ramping up, and there's been heavy battles here between the U.S.-backed government and al-Shabaab. In both of these instances, AFRICOM claimed no civilians were harmed, but the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting civilian casualties, as I always must mention, especially in Somalia. And the reason why I always have to say that is because there's no accountability for these U.S. operations in Somalia. The airstrikes receive very little coverage in the Western press, despite the high casualty rates being reported by AFRICOM. There's also, I remember in September, there were some pretty big casualty rates. So, I mean, I didn't look too hard, but all I saw, I usually just use the AFRICOM press releases. You go to AFRICOM's website and they announce their airstrikes. We don't know if it's all the airstrikes that are going on in Somalia, because there's also CIA drone strikes, and they don't have to publicize those. But the only outlet that I saw cover this was CNN, of all places, which they usually don't cover Somalia airstrikes. It's usually something like Military Times, one of the military news websites. But I didn't even see this in there. So nobody is paying attention to this, so there's no accountability. And I mean, right now, Somalia is the country that the U.S. is bombing, is launching drone strikes in the most, and nobody seems to be aware of it. Nobody's talking about it. There's occasional U.S. airstrikes in Syria and Iraq, but not at this point in 2022. It's Somalia. It seems to be the big one here, and the U.S. is considering escalating the war even further. The Somali government wants them to loosen restrictions on drone strikes. President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, he came in back in May, and he vowed to take a hard line on al-Shabaab, and they've launched offensives against al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab has launched, major bombings in Mogadishu and stuff, killing a lot of people. So it's been pretty bad situation there in Somalia. But it's right now kind of the situation is Biden's drone strike policy strikes outside of Iraq and Syria. So these strikes in Somalia, they don't specify in the AFRICOM press release, but they're probably drone strikes. They're probably all drone strikes. So the U.S. drone strike policy is if they're not in Iraq or Syria, they need White House approval. But there's a huge loophole, and the loophole is if they can be justified as in self defense of U.S. forces or U.S. partner forces. Well, every single one of these strikes that AFRICOM has been launching, they say it's in self defense. So they don't need the White House approval. But the Somali government is asking the U.S. to loosen those restrictions even more, even though they have that big loophole, so they could ramp up the strikes. And then if that happens, then they could really, they will definitely increase because they could launch strikes that would be considered preemptive, that they could justify as preemptive because they can't really do that right now without Biden or somebody in the White House okaying it. And Al Shabaab is hyped up by AFRICOM as a major threat due to its size and Al Qaeda affiliation. But, this group, it's a local group. There's no reason to think they're like a global terrorist organization. It was born out of a US backed Ethiopian invasion of Somalia. They're an offshoot of the Islamic Courts Union, who they were in charge in Mogadishu when Ethiopia invaded. They ousted them, and Al Shabaab were the kind of the hardliners of the Islamic Courts Union that really didn't have much influence, before the invasion. And I linked to a article from Scott Horton about it. This is just the best background on Ethiopia you could read. It's an adaptation of a chapter of his book on Somalia, of his book on the war on terror. It's the chapter about Somalia, so you could go check that out. But one thing that really struck me was that the national defense strategy that was just released by the Pentagon, it does not mention Al Shabaab or Somalia by name, even though that's where the U.S. has been launching its most frequent airstrikes. The strategy focuses on China and Russia and only mentions Al Qaeda and ISIS one time, saying that the groups and their affiliates have had their capabilities degraded, but may also be able to reconstitute them in short order. So the Pentagon says China and Russia are the top threats, China being top, then Russia. And then they mention Iran and North Korea, and then, these terrorist groups. So, it's just not even Somalia. It's not even worth a mention in the Pentagon strategy, yet that's the country we're bombing the most right now. It just shows how ridiculous it is. But anyway, that's it for me for the news for today. We have some really good viewpoints, as always. One from Ted Snyder on Russia China relations, one from Medea Benjamin and Nicholas J.S. Davies. More on Russia. We have a great one from Dan McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute, going after Josh Rogan, the neocon columnist for Washington Post. He's blaming Republicans that don't want to keep arming Ukraine for, of course, it's all their fault that Ukraine has lost territory. And then one at Responsible Statecraft from Branko March Teach about diplomacy and why it's, not as bad as they're all making it out to be. Oh, also the Spotlight links to a video from Reason that features Scott Horton, our editorial director, about the nuclear threat, about the Russia-Ukraine war. It's really good. You should go check it out. But that's it for today. I know I went a little long. I kind of was ranting about the Somalia thing, but I think it's pretty important. But support us, antiwar.com/donate. Excuse me. Subscribe to the show on YouTube, even if you don't watch it there. Just help me get those numbers going. Odyssey, Rumble, also video there. Download where you listen to podcasts. Leave a review. That's it. I'll be back tomorrow with more news. Thanks for listening.